The morning Beatrice Hartley sat alone in what had been her family's pew. She counted 7 empty seat cushions where her father's household had once arranged itself with the orderly confidence of people who expected to matter. The cushions were gone now, taken with the rest, and the bare oak beneath her was the color of old apologies. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her gaze fixed on the candles at the altar, because looking at the candles meant she could not see the faces turning toward her from the neighboring pews, each face conducting its small private arithmetic, adding up the plain gown and the absent servants and the seat stripped of its velvet and arriving at a sum that satisfied them. The Hartley debt stood at £4,200. She knew the number as precisely as she knew her own name, because it had been read to her 3 times by the family solicitor and once by the creditor's agent who came to the house on a Tuesday morning without removing his hat. £4,200 was what remained after the silver, and the paintings and the second carriage and the contents of her father's library had been converted into other men's comfort. The house in town had followed. Her father had followed the house, worn out by shame and a winter that would not relent, and Beatrice had followed the season alone, 23 years old and accounted, by the assembled opinion of the parish, to be a problem that had already been solved by time. She did not intend to call attention to herself that morning. She rarely intended anything that might invite notice. What happened instead was entirely the fault of a verger named Mr. Tibbs, who had that Sunday received a donated prayer book from the Ashmore estate, and who was about to shelve it in the wrong cabinet with the satisfied confidence of a man who has never been corrected by anyone he considered worth correcting. Beatrice saw the error before he had fully extended his arm. The donated volume bore the Ashmore crest pressed into its cover, which meant it was intended for the estate pew, not the general lending cabinet at the west wall. She rose from her bare pew quietly. She crossed the aisle. She said, in a voice pitched for the verger's ear alone, that the book belonged in the north cabinet, 3rd shelf, where the estate-dedicated volumes were kept, and that she was confident he knew this already and had simply been distracted. Mr. Tibbs had not known this. He turned to her with an expression of startled gratitude and corrected himself without any fuss. Beatrice returned to her pew. She had not looked toward the Ashmore family section. She had no particular reason to look there, and a number of reasons to look anywhere else. What she did not know, sitting with her hands refolded and her gaze returned to the altar candles, was that Edmund Carew, Lord Ashmore, had watched all of it from the moment she rose. He was 31 years old and had acquired over those years the quality of absolute stillness that very powerful men sometimes develop as a defense against the noise of being deferred to constantly. He had not been still when she rose. His body had made one small, involuntary adjustment, a shift of weight, a slight turn of the jaw, and he had then made himself still again, which was not at all the same thing. The sermon that followed lasted 1 hour and 9 minutes. Beatrice knew because she had counted, there being very little else available to her attention once she had exhausted the candles and the grain of the bare pew and the small theological argument embedded in the 3rd stanza of the morning hymn. Reverend Horace Finch was a man of genuine piety and variable economy, and on this particular Sunday the Spirit had moved him to thoroughness. She was in the churchyard afterward, pulling on a glove that had developed a small split at the thumb seam, when she heard a carriage draw up behind her. She did not look. She was attending to the glove. "Miss Hartley." The voice carried rank without lifting itself to perform rank. She turned. Edmund Carew stood at a distance of perhaps 8 feet, which was correct. He was taller than she had registered from across the church, his coat dark against the gray morning sky, his expression arranged in the composed neutrality of a man who has learned to give nothing away to an audience. His mother, Lady Dorothea Carew, was already seated in the carriage with the arrangement of a woman who has never waited for anything she did not choose to wait for. "Your Grace was wrong. He was an earl, "My lord," Beatrice said, and did not elaborate. "The vicar's sermon," he said, "ran long. 1 hour and 9 minutes, she said, before she had decided to say it. Something in his face shifted by a degree too small to identify. "I counted 48, he said. She looked at him steadily. "Then you stopped counting before it ended." A pause. Very brief. "So it appears," he said. And then his eyes moved past her to the churchyard gate, and the conversation was over before either of them had committed to having had one. He handed her into the Ashmore carriage without explanation, because she was on foot, and the sky had begun to threaten rain, and because Edmund Carew was a man who issued commands that functioned as protection and expected them to be followed. She sat across from Lady Dorothea and listened to the rain begin on the carriage roof. Lady Dorothea looked at the middle distance for the duration of the ride and said exactly one thing, which was that Beatrice's glove appeared to need attention. It was the sort of remark that was technically accurate and designed to land somewhere below the ribs. If the reader of this story is inclined to wonder where the whole of it is tending, the answer is toward a library at Windermere, with snow at the window and a book left open on a desk. Stay with it a little longer. The solicitor came to her lodgings on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after the sermon, which meant that Edmund had not acted impulsively. He had thought about it for 14 days and arrived at a considered position, which was very much in keeping with everything she would later learn about him. The solicitor was a Mr. Graves, small and precise, who set his hat on the table and explained the proposal without preamble. Lord Ashmore required a countess. He had been without one for 4 years. The estate required management in the particular areas where an earl's household depended on a woman's authority, and it had suffered for the want of it in ways that were beginning to show. The settlement he offered was £4,200, applied directly against the Hartley debt. In exchange, Miss Hartley would become Lady Ashmore, with full standing as countess and all appurtenant rights and responsibilities under the law. Mr. Graves did not use the word convenient. He was too professional for that. He simply laid the figures in front of her and waited. Beatrice looked at the numbers for a long time. £4,200, which was the exact sum of the debt, not a pound more or less, which told her that Edmund had been precise about what he was offering, and precise about what he was not. He was not offering hope. He was not offering feeling. He was clearing a ledger and acquiring a countess in a single transaction, and he had done the arithmetic carefully enough not to dress it as anything else. She signed the agreement that afternoon. She told herself, getting into the carriage that carried her toward Windermere 3 weeks later, that she was 23 years old and sensible, and that a woman who expected to be freely chosen when her family's name had been reduced to a debt schedule was a woman indulging in an expensive luxury. She did not expect to be chosen. She expected to be useful, which was something she had some history with. Windermere was larger than she had prepared herself to find it. The carriage came through an avenue of old limes, bare-branched in the late autumn cold, and then the house appeared, long and stone-fronted and serious, the kind of house that had been built by people who intended to be there for a very long time. There was a staff assembled at the entrance, which was correct. Edmund stood at the head of the steps, which was not required, and which she filed away without attaching a meaning to it. The housekeeper was a Mrs. Penrose, 50 or so, with a face like calm weather, and eyes that saw considerably more than her expression advertised. She showed Beatrice to her rooms, which were generous, and to the linen storage and the still room and the account books for the household, which told Beatrice everything she needed to know about what was actually being asked of her. The accounts were not in disorder exactly. but they had been kept by a man's hand in the shorthand way that men keep household accounts when there is no woman to keep them properly, and several years of that approach had produced a certain accumulated fog. Edmund did not come to her rooms. He did not come to dinner. Having ridden out to the North Fields on some estate matter that Mrs. Penrose mentioned without emphasis, Beatrice ate alone at the far end of a table that could have accommodated 20 and read the account books with a candle brought close. The first week at Windermere established the terms of their arrangement. Edmund was present at breakfast and occasionally at dinner. He was courteous in the way of a man who is determined to be courteous as a matter of discipline rather than warmth. He asked about the household accounts twice, listened to her answers with the full weight of his attention, and said nothing that was not directly responsive. She found the portrait on the 4th day. It was in the east corridor, between a landscape and a mirror, and it had been turned to face the wall. The frame was walnut, expensive, fitted to a canvas that was clearly larger than the landscapes beside it. She did not touch it. She walked past it and said nothing. But she thought about it for 3 days, before Mrs. Penrose, in the way that Mrs. Penrose had of delivering information as though she were simply thinking aloud, said that the First Lady Ashmore had died in childbed 4 years ago, and the infant with her, and that his lordship had turned the portrait himself the morning after the funeral, and had not spoken the name since. Beatrice stood in the still-room doorway with a jar of preserved pears in her hand and absorbed this carefully. A man who had lost a wife and a child in the same hour, and who had spent 4 years in the specific silence that such a loss produces, was not a cold man in the way she had assumed. He was a man who had built a discipline around a wound because the wound itself was intolerable. The discipline was not the same as the wound, but it lived in the same place, and you could not remove one without disturbing the other. She did not revise her expectations. She did not allow herself to do that. She simply carried the knowledge with her into the days that followed and was a little less surprised by his silences. The witnessing happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into the marriage, in the old schoolroom on the house's north side. Beatrice had discovered on her 2nd week at Windermere that the estate children, the sons and daughters of the farmhands and the grooms and the younger household staff, had no school day between the harvest close and the new year, their little schoolroom sitting empty for that stretch because the village schoolmistress went to her sister's in Durham. She had 7 volumes of her own remaining from her father's library, rescued before the creditors reached the shelves. A natural history, 2 volumes of geography, a primer of Latin she had used herself, and 3 collected works of improving fiction that she thought more useful than improving. She had brought them to Windermere in her trunk, with the vague idea that they might occupy her evenings. On the Tuesday in question, there were 11 children seated on the schoolroom benches at various angles of attention, and Beatrice was at the front of the room holding the natural history open to a page on the migration of swallows, explaining in terms she hoped were more interesting than the text itself, what swallows did with the months when England had nothing to offer them. She did not hear the door open. She heard, later, that it had opened, because Mrs. Penrose mentioned it in the same thoughtful aloud way she had mentioned the First Lady Ashmore, noting that his lordship had passed by the schoolroom Tuesday last and had not continued on as quickly as he usually did. Beatrice absorbed this information in the same manner she had absorbed the information about the portrait, placing it carefully where it would not become something she built upon, because building on such things had a history of being expensive. Edmund, standing in the corridor with his hand on the doorframe, had watched Beatrice Hartley hold 11 children's attention with a swallow's migration pattern and feel something shift in him that he was not prepared to name. He had watched her set the book down on the bench beside a girl of perhaps 8 years who had been straining to see the illustration. He had watched her move to the window to point at the actual sky, which contained, at that moment, no swallows at all, and heard the children laugh at something she said about it, something dry and brief that he could not quite catch from the corridor. He had stayed 4 minutes longer than he intended. He had then gone about his business and told himself that it was a practical observation of a practical woman being practically useful. He was not entirely wrong. He was not entirely right either. Lady Dorothea arrived at Windermere 10 days before Christmas, announced by a letter that came on Monday and by the lady herself on Saturday, which meant that Edmund had known his mother was coming and had said nothing, which Beatrice took to mean he had expected she would manage it. She intended to. Lady Dorothea was 61 years old and had the posture of a woman who had been told she was correct about everything for so long that she had incorporated the information into her skeleton. She was not unkind in any way that could be directly addressed. She was the kind of woman who noticed aloud that certain economies were visible in the new Countess's wardrobe, and who produced this observation in company in the tone of someone sharing a confidence, and who arranged her own guest, Miss Vivian Aldworth, in the drawing-room at every opportunity, like a decorative argument. Miss Aldworth was 20 years old and genuinely lovely, in the way of a woman who has never been required to be anything except genuinely lovely, with fair hair and a practiced softness of manner and the capacity to make any room she entered feel as though she had been the intended furniture all along. She was not cruel. She was Lady Dorothea's chosen candidate for the position that Beatrice now held, and she knew it, and she managed the knowledge with a composure that Beatrice respected, even while she understood it for what it was. The drawing-room exposure happened on the Thursday before Christmas, when Lady Dorothea had assembled what she no doubt considered a representative audience. Miss Aldworth, 2 neighboring gentry wives whose names were Mrs. Crail and Mrs. Pemberton, and a visiting cousin of Edmund's named Mr. Ashford, who seemed to have arrived because he had no particular reason not to. Lady Dorothea introduced the subject of the Hartley debt with a surgeon's precision. She did not name it directly. She described, in the voice of a woman performing charity, how difficult it must have been for a young woman of Beatrice's position to find herself so entirely at the mercy of circumstance, and how admirable it was that Edmund had been able to resolve the situation, meaning the £4,200, as neatly as he had. A provincial difficulty, she said, to no one in particular, resolved in the most practical manner. Mrs. Crail made a sound of sympathetic agreement. Mrs. Pemberton looked at her teacup. Miss Aldworth sat with her hands folded and her eyes fixed somewhere above the fireplace, which was either tact or the appearance of it. Beatrice said that she was grateful Lord Ashmore had seen the matter clearly, and that she understood the practical considerations had suited them both, and she said it in a tone that offered nothing to work with. She was not going to perform shame she did not feel. She had not been the author of her father's debts. She had been 23 years old when they arrived, inheriting obligations she had not made, and she had resolved them in the only way available to her. She was a countess with a household to run and 11 children who could now identify a swallow by its forked tail, and she intended to remain what she was. Lady Dorothea filed this away. Her next attempt, Beatrice suspected, would be more direct. It was. The letter appeared on the morning of Christmas Eve, delivered by Lady Dorothea's own maid to the drawing-room where the assembled guests had gathered after breakfast. Lady Dorothea held it in a way that suggested she had not expected to be delivering it, which was, Beatrice recognized, the particular performance of someone who had prepared very carefully. She said, in the voice of a woman performing regret, that this had come to her by mistake, addressed to the family solicitor, and that she felt it would be wrong to conceal it from those present, given that it appeared to be in Beatrice's hand. The letter proposed, in terms of legal clarity that Beatrice recognized immediately as not her own, that the marriage be dissolved by mutual agreement, the Countess having fulfilled the financial provisions of the settlement and wishing to return to her own situation. It bore what appeared to be Beatrice's signature. Beatrice read it where she stood. She read it a second time. The hand was a close approximation, but the legal language was not hers, and the phrase, "her own situation," was not a phrase she would have written, because she had no situation to return to, and had known that perfectly well when she signed Mr. Graves's agreement. More than that, the letter referred to the family solicitor as Mr. Graves, which was correct, but spelled his name with an E that she knew from 3 meetings with the man he did not use. Lady Dorothea had dictated the letter herself, probably to a secretary, probably with the comfortable authority of the senior female relative of a house whose staff had learned to act on her instruction without asking for written confirmation. Under the laws that governed Beatrice's existence, this was entirely plausible. Women's legal agency being so thoroughly constrained that a convincingly delivered instruction from a woman of sufficient rank could accomplish a great deal without anyone thinking to question it. Beatrice set the letter down on the table beside the tea things. The room was very quiet. She could hear the fire. She could hear Mrs. Pemberton's fan, opening and closing with the rhythm of someone trying to decide what expression to wear. "This letter," Beatrice said, in the same tone she had used to correct Mr. Tibbs in the churchyard, pitched for the room and not for any individual in it, "is a forgery." Lady Dorothea drew herself into the posture of a woman receiving an insult. "I beg your pardon. The solicitor's name is spelled incorrectly," Beatrice said. "I have corresponded with Mr. Graves on 4 occasions, and he spells his name without the E. The phrasing in the 3rd paragraph is legal language I did not write, and could not have written, as I have no training in the form. And the premise of the letter is false, as anyone who understood my circumstances at the time of signing would know. I had no situation to return to. I returned to this one." She looked at Lady Dorothea directly. She did not raise her voice. There was no need to raise a voice in order to be heard in a room that had gone as still as this one. "I did not write this letter," she said. "I did not dictate it. I did not authorize it." Mrs. Crail had set down her cup. Mr. Ashford was examining the portrait above the mantel with the concentrated attention of a man who wishes he were in another county. Miss Aldworth's hands remained folded in her lap, but her composure had taken on a different quality, the look of someone who has watched the ground shift and is deciding how much distance to put between herself and the place where it shifted. Lady Dorothea opened her mouth. Edmund came through the door from the corridor. He had been on the far side of the house. He had not heard the letter read. He had heard, when he came through the passage from the library, the particular quality of silence that follows a charge made aloud in company, the held-breath silence of a room waiting to see what comes next. And he had come through the door and read the room in 3 seconds, which was all the time his intelligence required. His gaze went to Beatrice first. She was standing beside the tea things with her hands at her sides and her expression composed to absolute calm, which he had come to understand was not the absence of feeling, but the containment of it, the deliberate management of a woman who had learned that any display she permitted would be used against her. He crossed the drawing-room. She had not appealed to him. That was what moved him past the threshold he had been standing behind for weeks, conducting careful observations and arriving at careful conclusions and putting each conclusion away in a place where it would not require him to act on it. She had not looked to him. She had not appealed, had not performed distress, had not offered the room the satisfaction of watching her falter. she had simply stated in a clear voice what was true, and stood beside what she had said. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stood at her side, and the geometry of the room changed immediately, because Edmund Carew, standing beside a person, was not a neutral event. "Beatrice," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name in company. And Lady Dorothea heard it, and Mrs. Crail heard it, and Mrs. Pemberton's fan stopped. He picked up the letter from the table and read it once, quickly. "This did not come from my countess," he said. He was not looking at his mother. He was looking at the room, which was a colder and more effective thing. "I know her hand. I know her habits of expression. And I know that she arrived at Windermere without a situation to return to, because I was given accurate information about her circumstances before I made my proposal, and I read it carefully." He set the letter down. "The letter is, as my wife has already told you, false," Lady Dorothea said in a voice that had lost some of its architecture. "Edmund, I was only attempting to ensure that you had not been deceived into a situation you did not fully understand." "I understood it," he said quietly. "I understand it now. I understood it when I asked her to come here, and I understand it better than I did then." He turned to Beatrice. And this was the moment that the room, all of it, every face, attended to without being invited to. "Lady Ashmore," he said formally, for the witnesses, and then, lower, for her. "Beatrice, you have the full standing of this house. My mother knows this. The room knows this. I am sorry it was necessary to state it in these terms." Lady Dorothea sat down, which was not something she had intended to do. She sat down because her certainty, which had been her only armor for 61 years, had encountered something it could not process, which was a son who was not looking to her for permission, and a daughter-in-law who had not required rescuing, and a room full of witnesses who had all just watched accuracy defeat confidence in a single exchange. She was not destroyed by this. She was corrected, and she was old enough and intelligent enough to know the difference, even if she needed some quiet hours to arrive at the knowing. Miss Aldworth rose, with the graceful economy of a woman who has accepted a position and decided to hold it well, and excused herself with a murmured word about letters she had forgotten to write. She left without drama and without spite, and Beatrice thought, watching her go, that Miss Aldworth would find her way to a situation that suited her better, because she had the kind of composed intelligence that deserved something more than being arranged in drawing rooms as an argument. Mrs. Crail made a remark about the weather. Mrs. Pemberton agreed. Mr. Ashford found a reason to examine the bookshelves. The room reorganized itself around the knowledge of what had just happened, the way rooms do when the ground has shifted and everyone present has privately decided to carry on. Edmund stayed beside Beatrice until the room's temperature had returned to something bearable, and then he said, in a voice pitched only for her, "You are not required to remain in this room." "I know," she said. "I prefer to." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face, in the area of the jaw and the eyes, did a thing she had not seen it do before. Not quite a smile, the precise antecedent of one. "So it appears," he said, which were the same words he had used in the churchyard, and she recognized them. And he had intended for her to recognize them. She stayed in the drawing room for another half-hour, poured tea with perfect steadiness, and spoke pleasantly to Mrs. Pemberton about the prospects for snow before Christmas. She did not look at Edmund more than necessary. She did not need to. The geometry of the room had already confirmed what she needed to know, and she was a woman who trusted evidence. The snow came that evening, a quiet snow that fell straight down in the absence of wind, and covered the Windermere grounds by midnight, in a silence so complete that Beatrice could hear it from the library, where she had gone after dinner to return 2 of the estate account books to their shelf, and had stayed because the library at Windermere was the most comfortable room in the house, and she had finally admitted this to herself. She was standing at the window with her hand against the cold glass when Edmund came in. He did not explain his presence. He crossed to his own desk, which was at the room's far end near the hearth, and she heard him sit. She heard the small sound of a book being opened. After a moment she turned, because she did not need the pretense of studying the snow. On his desk, beside the lamp, was one of her 7 volumes, The Natural History, with the swallows. It was open to the migration page, and there were marginal notes in his hand in the narrow margins. Brief, precise, the kind of notes a man makes when he is reading something properly and wants to remember his own responses to it. She could not read them from across the room. She did not try. The fact of the notes was enough. "When did you read it?" she said. He did not pretend not to know what she meant. "In October," he said, "after the schoolroom. Mrs. Penrose told me where she had found it, and I asked if I might borrow it." October was before the witnessing. He had borrowed the book before he watched her teach from it, which meant something she would need a little quiet time to understand properly. "You could have asked me," she said. "You were not yet here in October," he said. "The book was in the trunk your housekeeper helped carry in. I asked Mrs. Penrose to retrieve it." A pause. "I have returned it now." She looked at the volume on his desk, with its marginal notes in his careful hand. "So you have," she said. She crossed the room and sat in the chair nearest the fire, which was not his chair, and not a chair she had claimed before. She sat in it with the directness of a woman who has decided to stop being careful about what she claims. She picked up the volume from his desk, not to read it, but to hold it, and looked at the notes in the margins, which were, she now saw, primarily questions. Not conclusions, questions. In the form of a man who does not know the answers and intends to find out. "The swallows," she said. "You have written, where exactly?" With a mark of punctuation that is not quite a question mark. "I was uncertain whether it was a question," he said. It felt more like an intention. She looked at him over the book. He was looking back at her, and his face had the quality she had seen in the drawing room, that small, warm antecedent of something she now understood would eventually arrive. She thought of what she had believed in the churchyard 2 months ago, sitting in the bare pew with the stripped cushions and the debt schedule and the £4,200 pressing down on whatever future she had been able to imagine for herself. She had not expected to be seen. She had not allowed herself to expect it. She had accepted a ledger transaction and called it enough, and had brought her 7 books and her account book precision and her dry remarks about the sky and arranged them into the shape of a useful life. She had not built upon the deniable attentions. She had placed them carefully in a location where they would not become something she relied on. And he, on the other side of that careful management, had spent 4 years in a silence built from grief, and had watched her from a doorway, and had read her book, and had crossed a drawing room, and had said her name. She had been seen. Not in the way the season saw people, calculating worth and assigning verdicts in a language made entirely of omission, in the way that mattered, specific and earned and completely unable to be explained away. The vicar's sermon, she said, lasted 1 hour and 9 minutes. "I stopped counting at 48, he said. "You stopped," she said, "because something else had your attention." A pause, brief, measured, and not entirely empty. "Yes," he said. "So it appears." He looked at her across the library table with his careful face and his book of questions, and the fire was low and steady behind him, and the snow went on falling outside the window in the Windmere grounds, covering the lime avenue and the north fields and the stone front of the house that had been built by people who intended to remain in it for a very long time. Beatrice set the natural history on the table between them, open to the migration page, and did not look away. Later, much later, when the fire had been built back and the house was quiet, she rose and walked to the east corridor and stood before the portrait in its walnut frame. She put her hand on the frame's corner, the wood cool and smooth under her fingers. She did not turn it. She simply stood there with her hand at its edge and thought about a woman she had never known and a child who had not lived long enough to be known by anyone, and what they had made of the man who sat in the library reading migration patterns and writing questions in the margins. Edmund appeared in the corridor doorway. He stood there without speaking. She did not remove her hand from the frame. He crossed the corridor and stood beside her. She waited to feel the correction of a man protecting what he had put away. It did not come. He stood beside her and looked at the turned frame, and after a long moment he reached out and touched the frame's opposite corner, just briefly, his fingers alongside hers on the walnut. He did not turn the portrait. That was not the gesture. The gesture was simply that he let her stand there beside him with her hand on the frame, which was not nothing. It was the opposite of nothing. They stood in the corridor with the snow outside and the frame between them, and Beatrice thought that this was what she had not known how to hope for, which was not rescue, not the reversal of a verdict, but simply this: a man standing beside her in the cold corridor of a house she was learning to call her own, with his hand near hers on the frame of a wound they had both agreed, without speaking, not to be afraid of anymore. If you found yourself staying with Beatrice and Edmund through the long Sunday and the Windmere winter, leave a word in the comments about the moment that held you. There are more stories here, waiting in the quiet. The library fire burned low and steady through the night, and on Edmund's desk, beside the lamp, the natural history lay open at the migration page, and in the margin beside the illustration of the swallow in flight, in Edmund's careful hand, was the single word he had written before he had the words for any of it. The word was, stay.